You're listening to Talking Africa, the podcast from the Africa Report that gets behind the news from the continent. I'm Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the show. For our news, analysis and comment, do head to theafricareport.com. Today on the podcast, a discussion about the End SARS protests in Nigeria and the direction of the country after the brutal shooting on Tuesday night of young Nigerians who were themselves protesting police brutality. The acts of violence in the days that followed, which include the burning of buildings, jailbreaks and looting, are all just so much state-sanctioned provocation, say many of the protesters who see in it an attempt to undermine their reform goals. In this edition of Talking Africa, we talk to 4 Nigerians and 1 Oyimbo, our Nigeria correspondent, Ruth Oloroyinbi, Nigerian columnist, Donu Kogbara, the Africa editor of OZY, Eremo Egbejule, who is formerly of this parish, our editorial dynamo Tofe Ayeni, and Patrick Smith, our editor-in-chief. We begin with Ruth, who is in Abuja, where it is almost too quiet.
Yesterday, around Durumi area, Garki, Apo, and Co, there was some kind of conflict there. It seems as if the conflict is a spillover of what has happened in the past couple of days, where we've seen hoodlums or thugs take over the otherwise peaceful protests that had gone on for 10 days prior to the thugs coming to invade. And the feeling out there is that might quickly escalate to some sort of religious or tribal conflict. But in the central area of Abuja, it's relatively calm, and it's weird because the silence feels so thick and you're wondering what's happening. Because even during the lockdown, it wasn't as this quiet, so which is weird.
The local poultry are underlining the point of of it being eerily calm in Abuja today.
Yeah.
Tofe, you've just come back from Lagos, and obviously lots of friends and family in Lagos. What is the mood as people start to take a breath?
People are feeling kind of helpless, especially after the president's address yesterday, where he didn't mention what had happened in Lekki or in other parts of the country on Monday? I think people are feeling quite helpless. There is still police on the roads. I saw today a friend of a friend, he was driving somewhere to get food because the curfew was quite sudden and police were shooting at them. Apparently outside is very quiet. There's a lot of military on the street, which is not normal. Well, I never really saw military on the street. There was always a lot on police, but not actual military men. So I think people are feeling very helpless. There's also the feeling of all these, the thugs / hoodlums, but I feel that it's more kind of like you can't shut down a city for 3 days where everyone or most people live hand to mouth. So that is why the looting is happening. And they found the COVID palliatives in a warehouse and people were looting that. And it's like, those are things for the people. So I don't really like subscribe to the thugs and hoodlums trying to mess up the country. I think the government has failed and everyone is feeling helpless, doesn't know what to do, and is just kind of acting out now.
We've seen, Eremo, at various points across the country, these jailbreaks, with many people sort of questioning the timing and indeed the responsibility for them. From the outside, it looks like someone is trying to derail what was a very well organized and civil and polite protest against police brutality, and under the blanket of, well, it's violent now, so we're going to just have to lock everyone up until it's over. Get rid of all those difficult demands for police reform, and it does rather recall what we saw just a few months ago in the United States, where protesters who are out peacefully protesting police brutality are then attacked, and under this cover of a blanket call to end violence, much more big state security moves in. In that context, how should we see these jailbreaks?
I think it's very important that you draw this parallel between the US trying to silence Black Lives Matter protesters and Nigeria doing the same thing directly or indirectly, because what we've seen here is that these youths have organized some sort of a subnational democracy within a larger one, provided everything that it needed, organized democracy, and the people within the states, when I say the states, within the presidency or state and federal governments, who believe that regime security is more important than national security. And so with or without the approval of the president, I think that certain elements in government may have been staging an intervention, a very violent one at that. And, beyond that, I think that generally there was a well-orchestrated counter display, which we have seen in these prisons. And, it was something that even Buhari alluded to in his speech, one part of his speech where he says, where he subliminally tells protesters not to allow subversive elements who want to truncate our nascent democracy. So I think that even Buhari probably knows, that he's not in full control of, the country, and that some elements within his government or the military, are also trying to take advantage of this protest and create violence. And I think that's something that happened on a similar but perhaps smaller level in the US as well.
Donu, you're normally very lenient on the Nigerian government and its managing of state affairs. How do you judge the response to the shooting of protesters in Lekki and the sort of 24 hours of violence that followed?
I'm not normally very lenient.
That was a joke.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm glad, because some of the stuff I've written, the newspapers won't publish. So anyway, it's funny. I probably started off being lenient, ironically, despite my complaint, because I actually campaigned for Buhari on 3 grounds. One was my belief that because he was a military man, he would be able to resolve chronic security problems like the Boko Haram insurgency and the widespread kidnapping and banditry. The second was that I bought into the narrative that he was viscerally opposed to corruption. I have had cause to completely backpedal on these opinions about him. And my view about the government's behavior in the past couple of weeks is that the government has behaved appallingly. And I think really stupidly as well. I mean, it's like, why shoot yourself in the foot by shooting people, unarmed youngsters? I mean, it's not a very intelligent response. You can predict that everybody, the whole world and his wife, is going to descend on you. And I don't understand why they would do this to themselves. It's like they've won the battle, but they're not going to win the war because everybody's against them now, except for their own sort of like small cronyistic cabals.
Patrick, is this because the current era we are living in is not like the 1980s, and whereas those instincts, okay, we've had a couple of decades of democracy, but really nothing has changed within the mentality of those elites running the country. So they're still on that, software from the 1980s, but actually, the people are different, the society is different, and they will not accept it this time.
Yeah, I think that's right on the money. When I was listening to President Buhari's speech last night, did occur to me I could have got into my time traveling machine and gone back to the early months of the military regime in 1984, appropriately enough. And there wouldn't have been much difference. It's, we're here to protect you. We're here to uphold national unity, and trust us. And we're the military. And there was, as Tofe said, there was no reference to the terrible events this week where Amnesty have said that 56 people, since the beginning of the protest, over 56 people have lost their lives. That was the first thing. There was just no reference to that. And just on the basic notion of empathy, I think, that was incredible. And all, Nigerians I've spoken to, that was the initial reaction. Second thing is, there's going to be about 400 million people in Nigeria over the next 10, 15, 20 years. It's going to be the third most populous country by the end of this the century. And it just doesn't seem, for a population now where 60% of the population are under 30, there doesn't seem to be any recognition of that in the response from the government. So I think it's absolutely different from 1980, where you had a population of 55 million, and there were a lot of old geezers, and the old geezers were still running everything. And although the old geezers are still running most things in Nigeria, there is an entirely different demographic. It's much, in every sense of the word, it's just in terms of the age cohorts, but also in terms of the skill cohorts. And I thought it was a weird synchronicity that, the tech sector suddenly pulled in $200 million like this in an investment for, the Paystack outfit. That just showed that there's a completely new economy that the young Nigerians have created out of nothing, out of their own brain power and innovation and ambition, something the government should be engaging with and promoting, because it's the future. They've got another 10 years on the hydrocarbons-dominated economy that was what we used to see in the 1980s, and enabled them to say Nigeria is the biggest population in Africa and it's the biggest economy. Look at our oil resources, look at our gas resources, and look how strong the economy is. That's got 10 years to run. That sort of, I think it's economic delusion. They've got to make this big shift to a new economy, a new structure. And talking to the population that are going to produce that is just the most essential thing. And it's not being done. So, yeah, I think it's a totally different world from the 1980s. And on one level, it's a very exciting world. And the young people are looking not at what's happening, was happening in the 1980s in Nigeria. They're looking at what's happening now in South Korea and Indonesia and Malaysia and Thailand and Brazil and so on, and India and China, working out what they can take from that and make Nigeria a very different country in the future. But it doesn't seem to be any recognition of their role in doing that, their power to do that from the government.
Donu, I just wanted to rebound on something that Eremo said a while back about how regime security appears more important than national security, and just to sort of reflect a bit about the sort of the connective tissue of power in Nigeria today. We've heard reports that some of the governors were not actually able to reach the president, this week. So who really is, who's in charge in Nigeria, if that's not too broad a question?
The governor of Lagos specifically said that he could not reach the president for 2 days during the height of the crisis, at the height of the crisis, which is really quite shocking. Now, Abba Kyari, the former chief of staff, who was a kind of Cardinal Richelieu type of eminence grise or noir, is gone. He died at the beginning of the COVID crisis. And everyone used to blame him for everything, right? So everyone said, oh, it's Abba Kyari who's pulling the strings in the background. To be honest with you, I don't know who's pulling the strings now, because the new chief of staff, Gambari, used to be our ambassador to the United Nations. and is a pretty urbane kind of fellow, I think. And I don't hear people blaming him for things that are going wrong. So I'm just wondering, well, Abakir is not here to blame anymore, and Gambari is not widely regarded as a sort of evil genius behind the scenes. So who's the person who's running this show? A couple of names come up from time to time. The president's nephew, there's a young nephew and an old nephew who are said to be highly influential. With the First Lady, Aisha Buhari, has actually had open running battles with them. And sometimes they've turned physical. A few months ago, the First Lady's security detail actually shot at one of them. So it's, they're probably part of a small group of people who are calling the shots. But even the sort of senior nephew, which is Mama, who's again often thought to be immensely influential, is in London. He's in no position to call any shots at the moment. So who is it? To be honest with you, I don't know. And I can tell you it's not the vice president either.
It does seem to be leaving a dangerous power vacuum. Eromo, are there any parallels from previous decades that the country can look to for a start? And secondly, if we see Buhari as kind of a last of the Mohicans type figure, he's the last one of that generation, which came to power in the 60s and 70s and held on as military rulers for so long. What then comes after Buhari?
I think it's quite interesting that if you want to think of parallels, to this last few years in terms of extreme police brutality, and also in terms of a rudderless ship, that you probably have to go back to Buhari himself, because over the last few days, I've been seeing stories, I've seen old newspaper clips that point out to a lot of brutality under Buhari. First of all, not just from the police, but also from the army and also from paramilitary organizations like War Against Indiscipline. And there have been conflicting reports. Some reports put the foundation of SARS, this rogue police unit, in 1992. But I've also seen some other reports talk about how SARS is rooted in in a police unit that was started by both Buhari and his deputy Tunde Diagbon, who was probably more of a dictator than Buhari himself. So we'll probably have to go back all the way, and when you talk about rudderless ship, right, the last most powerful vice president before, since apart from Atiku Abubakar, has also been Tunde Diagbon, right? No other vice president has had the kind of powers that these two men have had, So moving forward, though, as Donu has perfectly said, no one is sure who's in control. It is not number one. So number two, there's no Saraki this time who is ambitious to take advantage of the situation or take some sort of control. So it's not like number three or number four instead. There's no Abakari. And honestly, we don't know, which is why I said that Buhari's talk about subversive elements might be that he recognizes that he himself is not in control of his government. It might be some elements within the army, So it's very interesting to watch Nigeria just dance around on autopilot. Even when Yar'Adua was president and he was ill, at least you still had some sort of cabal, and you had a face to it, or at least people knew that his wife was this, you had people, but you honestly cannot point out right now who is in control. It's very tough to point out who is in control. So I think that Nigeria has been here before, right? And these are not the best of times. These are not the best of times. It also doesn't help that there is no election period coming close. So Buhari is in his second term. There's no incentive to perform. This is a guy who is living his dream job. Being a pensioner in office. So I think that I honestly have nothing else to say because if I go back, these are times that Nigeria has been through before, right? It's like deja vu, honestly.
I just wanted to share some gossip I heard. Someone who's quite well connected told me that the shooting in Lekki actually was arranged by rogue elements in other state security outfit, which is called the DSS, and that nobody knew they were going to strike, not least the governor of Lagos had no idea. And I think what's interesting is that they kept on demanding to know who the leaders of the youth protest movement were, presumably so they could single them out and offer them all sorts of incentives to shut the whole thing down. But, nobody's quite sure who the leaders of the movement are, and nobody's quite sure who's running the presidency. So you have these two amorphous situations where there are no clear points of authority who are making decisions. But another thing I want to say quickly was that Buhari has been accused of so many things, including cognitive decline, as in dementia, right? And there was a lot of speculation about why he didn't come out sooner, why he was sort of like invisible in the first few days of the crisis when people were yearning for some unifying national broadcast. And so, there was actually at some point a belief that he simply couldn't address the nation, that he was in some kind of mental decline that prevented him from doing that. I was quite surprised by how upright and firm he sounded on Thursday nights. I don't know if anybody else agrees with me that he sounded fine. He sounded like as if he knew exactly what he was talking about. So can I suggest a very radical opinion, being that perhaps he is in charge?
That is a radical indeed opinion. Please send your letters to feedback@africareport.com. But I just wanted to rebound on that idea of an amorphous mass of youth leadership. Ruth, you wrote about this for us earlier in the week, actually, about how this was one of the strengths of this End SARS movement, that it wasn't putting up leaders, because previous attempts at reform had seen their leadership co-opted so quickly. How is that evolving? Are we still seeing no leaders? Are people trying to co-opt? Are people trying to emerge? Is there now a debate? Do people think there should be leaders?
Right now, I still think that the movement is still leaderless, although we have some frontliners. We've had them. There were frontliners, people who were organizing funding, who are organizing relief or medical or legal support and all of that. But to a very, very large extent, we still see that this still continues to be a leaderless movement. I was talking with Aisha Yusufu the other day, and she kept telling me that the young people are the ones driving this, and we the older ones that are lending support will go wherever they want us to go. We're not taking this over. We're not going to be the ones to tell them what to do. They will tell us what to do, and we will follow what it is that they want to do. But we've seen some people who tried to come up to say that let's do it this way, let's do it that way. And we've also seen swift reactions that had said that no, you do not represent us, you're not our leader, and this is a leaderless movement, we're not going to follow you. And I think, like you said, it comes from history and of the organized labor, for instance, that has threatened since Buhari came into power to go on multiple strike actions, and that had never happened. I think the only two organizations to my recollection that had actually gone on strike are the doctors and the oil and gas people. Those are to my recollections, the ones that have gone on. Then the lecturers also, since Buhari took over. So I think that people are learning from those mistakes and seeing that leaders who had claimed to have like for instance, we have Oshomole, who was who was once a leader, Labour leader, and we've seen how that turned out. So I think young people are learning from that, and I say that we want to have a definite result or outcome from this protest, and we don't want to have any leader compromise our stand, or we don't want this to just go down the drain. I mean, I tried to interview somebody the other day, and the person said, if I give you an opinion, it's my opinion. It's not the opinion as a leader, but it's just a opinion as somebody who is part of this protest. So yeah, so I still think that it's still a leaderless movement at the moment.
Tofe, just on this idea of the stamina of the youth in this protest, which looks like it's going to have to be a long distance run rather than a sprint. What's your sense on that?
I feel like the youth in the past 2 weeks has been really very inspiring to see how people could come together and do all of that. It's been really inspiring to see, especially like the feminist co, like FK Abudu, how they did everything the government is meant to do and don't do. They were able to give people food. They were able to feed people every day, get ambulances to them. If they needed care, pay for medical bills, everything that the government should do, young people were able to do in not that much time by simply raising funds, even though the government has a budget. I think that from yesterday, when people started realizing that it is actually not just going to change, we do have to keep on with this for a very long time. And as I think someone said, the next election isn't for a long time, so it's a bit difficult to know what to do. But I think people still are hopeful. People are still willing. People are trying to re-strategize and see what it is that they can do further, seeing as, I mean, going back on the street when it seems like we will be met with violence might not be the best process. But I do think that people are ready to do it in the long run. I think people don't want to end up kind of like our parents' generation, in that Buhari has shut us down once and then we're going to stop. We need to keep going. We need to keep up the momentum. But I think the youth are we're very, very tired of being ruled by people that don't understand us and are too old or don't even care to try to understand us. Even like the Buhari's quote unquote live interview or live address yesterday, it was very, very clearly edited and not live. And everyone that's young would know that it was not. Like, we can't be tricked in the same way, I think, because we understand the modern world more.
Hey, we're not stupid either.
Go on, walk that one back, Tofe. Go on.
Yeah, everyone.
Generational warfare.
But no,
proud of the youth.
Can I say something very important, Nick? I'm sorry to interrupt. But one of the groups that has been prominent in terms of raising money and morale, I won't name them because they've asked me not to, has been identified by the authorities as troublemakers with leadership tendencies, and they are all in hiding at the moment because they have heard that they're going to be hunted down.
It is chillingly familiar to people who see youth protests around the world. Egypt right now obviously had its spring almost a decade ago now. And one of the interesting things about the Egypt uprising was the fact that this wasn't a flash in the pan. There had been 4 years previously an attempt to organize, and unions and the youth had got together and were very badly repressed back then. 4 years later, the embers of those networks eventually managed to push this uprising. So this idea of a long distance run, I think, is appropriate. Patrick, what other parallels can be drawn between youth movements in Africa, Asia, and the US?
Yeah, well, I think the important one when you talk about long distance running would be the Sudanese revolution, because what happened in 2013 was there was a protest movement, very similar to what's been happening in Nigeria in the last few weeks. And the regime then, under Omar el-Bashir, just ripped through that movement and shot over 100 people dead in cold daylight. And there were a few sort of harumphs from the European Union and the US. No one did anything. But I think there were more subtle warnings put out that that wasn't possible again. So that for the regime, because the army started splitting, the security services started splitting over the tactics they were going to use. So what the protest movement did at that stage was to decentralize, and they went region by region and set up these committees, and above and beyond campaigning about how terrible the government was. It was running 3 civil wars at the same time. It was repressing people. It was stealing the resources. It was imposing this extremely hardline Islamist rule on people. They mobilized the professional forces in the society. That is, the doctors, the teachers, the pharmacists, the engineers, and they produced. They helped to work with local people, producing services at street committee level. So between 2013 and what happened last year, the sort of glorious revolution in Sudan, there were real organizations on the ground in each region, these so-called revolutionary committees. They worked under extremely tight rules. They were very disciplined. They had absolutely no truck with the troublemakers and the looters and the opportunists. And it was that level of organization that culminated in the ability to mobilize 500,000 people to sit outside, to occupy the ground outside the military headquarters in Khartoum, triggering the organization. I mean, you've seen parallel things with El Hirak in Algeria. Both, it should be said, ended up pushing out the president, and that was their aim of the movement in Sudan and the movement in Algeria. I think that the issue in Nigeria is not pushing out a particular leader. I think it's much broader than that. The police brutality issue is the symbol of what people are saying is a rotten system, and it needs root and branch reform. And I think that's why it's going to be a much more complex struggle and campaign. But I don't see any sign of it ebbing. I think that it will take a different form. And I think more likely, I mean, if it's going to sustain itself, it's going to be much more decentralized across the 36 states of the country. And it's going to find ways to put pressure on the establishment, on the political class, on the political parties, and perhaps on alternative parties and alternative formations. But I think it's far from dimming. And I think this is, the sort of movements you're seeing as we're seeing in Thailand, as we saw in Hong Kong, as we saw with Black Lives Matter in the US. These are similar demographically. They're young people demanding a response to injustice. And they can't be dimmed. There's too much on now. There's social media, the capacity to spread information, messages, details about what's going wrong with government is so much stronger now than 10, 20 years ago even. I think it's going to take new forms, and it's going to go ahead and become a more serious force in politics.
A dramatic reveal, Eremo, to tell our listeners that you're actually in Abidjan currently, not in Lagos. But we're seeing something similar happening, I think, in Côte d'Ivoire at the moment. There are a bevy of leaders in their 70s and 80s who will not leave the levers of power alone. And you have now increasingly restive youth political awakening that's happening in Côte d'Ivoire. Without trying to sort of sketch out grand narratives of African youth stepping up to the plate and changing the destiny of the continent in the next decade, are we seeing something which is more than just flash in the pan in one country and a flash in the pan in another?
Yeah. I think definitely it's not just necessarily a flash in the pan. I mean, of course, the length is going to of this protest movement is going to vary from country to country. But I think what is probably happening, is that there are a lot less military regimes on the continent now than there were, say, 20, 30 years ago. And with this sort of democratic stability comes the rise, no matter how small, of a middle class that can fund protests against the upper class. So, for example, here in Abidjan, even though it's not been 10 years, since the end of the Civil War, and even though the same old characters as in Nigeria, are still rotating around the presidency. You have Henri Bedi, who's 86 or so, and was president in 95 to 93 to 99. You have all of these characters still circling around the presidency. But what you have is, because Cote d'Ivoire has been one of the fastest growing economies, average of 7% growth every year since 2011, you then have people who can organize, who can create protest movements, who can fund, protest movements, which is also the same thing in Nigeria. The Feminist Coalition, and all of the other small groups, that join together. These are people who work in fintech, as the economies keep popping up because of democratic stability, you're having, more and more protests, So even if they don't achieve what they're supposed to achieve, I think the youth and the middle class, sometimes, intersecting as a Venn diagram, have realized that they have the power to be able to do this. And, as more and more places, especially in East Africa and North Africa, as they transit back or strengthen their democracies, I think we're just going to be seeing pockets of resistance across the continent. I've also mentioned that there was the Algerian youth-led protest, the Iraq movement, or the Revolution of Smiles, which started last year in February, and it continued even after the president resigned. It continued, and this year they're still protesting. So I don't think that this is a sprint. I think it's a marathon, and it might be coincidental, or it might, as I explained, be because people are having more disposable cash and more. The world has become more interconnected, so people can see, my colleagues, my peers across the continent, my peers in the US are protesting, so therefore I have inspiration to protest. So it might be that. But also beyond that, there was one quick thing I wanted to say, which might sound like I may sell out to my generation. I've seen a lot of people talk about how youth of this generation, we're doing what our parents could not do. That's both true and false, because every generation comes and thinks that the one before it, didn't put in enough work. But then I remember when the people like Fela Kuti, for example. Fela Kuti was at the height of military regime. He was calling generals out by names. We haven't reached that level yet. These were people who were coming out from prison. I think there's still speculation about how Fela might have been infected with AIDS by the government. His brothers. Wole Soyinka was in prison for so long. Even Fahimi, Bola Tinubu himself, had to live in exile. So we've done a lot, right? We've coalesced as one youth movement, and it's also happening across the continent. But even Alpha Conde, who's trying to do a third-term movement in Guinea, Alpha Conde was arrested by, was it Lassana, a previous president, for opposing stuff, So the only prayer is that we don't become what we're fighting, because that's what happened to the generation before us. It's not that they didn't protest. There's some of the governors right now who protested very well, lost family members because of this, and have now taken leadership as a right. So I think
we mentioned Oshiomhole earlier on.
Yes, Oshiomhole,
classic one.
Tinubu, the Nadeko coalition that Tinubu and I think Governor Fayemi was also part of it. Some other governors, when you look at some of those people now, they later turned out to either be on the same level as those who oppressed them, or start out oppression on their own level. So even Buhari himself went out to protest with Tunde Bakare and the late Chuba Okadipo in 2003, 2007, different times, So I think the prayer should be that as youths across different parts of the continent are protesting, that we don't become the leaders, that we're fighting against.
I think
it will be phenomenally disastrous.
You do touch on the human condition there.
I'm very glad that Eromo acknowledged the inputs, the contributions of previous generations, because one of the hallmarks of youth is a certain arrogant belief that you are inventing the wheel, and actually you are standing on the shoulders of people who came before you. I mean, I have an uncle even before my generation. I'm 60, right? Even before my generation, I had an uncle who was arrested every single week while he was at the University of Ibadan. He was a student leader. So, there's been plenty of complaining from young people of different generations in this country. So it's nice to know that a young person actually acknowledges that some of the people who came before him actually contributed. Of course, there's a tendency to join the establishment and forget about your youthful idealism, which is what has happened to people like Tinubu. But it's good to acknowledge that there was a time when he was an activist. And that's very important.
I want to also talk about the raw politics. That we have the sort of the fantastic historical perspective of merchants funding the opposition, which has been one of the drivers of history for thousands of years. So it's great that the fintech people are pitching in now in Nigeria. And we've had this fantastic view of the human condition from Aramo and Donu as we go from student leader to aging autocrat. But beyond all this sort of 35,000 feet stuff, it feels like there is also some very raw politics going on at the moment. And I've seen it mentioned on social media that this was an attempt to sandbag Tinubu and get rid of him from the 2023 race. How much credence should we put in those ideas? Is it just rumor, or is there something more?
I think there's some truth in it. I don't know if they planned it from the beginning, but I think there are certain elements in Abuja who are delighted that he's being humiliated and that his political career is effectively over. Just before the protest started, the SARS protest started, Tinubu set up his presidential campaign office in Abuja about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I know that there are certain elements at the center who are not happy about the power he wielded. I don't know why they're so ungrateful, because quite frankly, they would not have the jobs they have now without Tinubu. Look, I'm not defending Tinubu. I can't say I'm a huge fan of his by any means, but I do think that there are some people who have found it very convenient and very delightful that Tinubu is in trouble. And I don't think he gave the order for that shooting, by the way.
I mean, I agree. I think he was definitely collateral damage, but someone took advantage of the chaos and the lack of leadership, as you said, to institute this. Definitely could not have been, let's not say definitely, right? Because it did look like he was involved, but I don't think Tinubu was. But somebody looked at it, the most prominent spot in all of the protests was the Lekki tollgate, right? It had international attention. You had foreign journalists there, It reminded that the protest didn't start in Lagos, but it crystallized, coalesced, and that became a really very important, spot in the coalition. And somebody looked at it right at the tollgate. Who is most associated with the tollgate? That asset. It's Bola Tinubu, and people have been looking for ways to cut him short. So I think this was what we call it, mother fate through an opportunity in the lap of people who have been targeting him. And someone took it and executed it very well. Whether or not he will totally be buried is another thing, but I think this was like a perfect execution of.
It's interesting that the president did not mention with any sorrow, did not mention at all, the fact that his television station has been burnt down and his properties are being targeted. If someone made me president of Nigeria or anywhere, even president of Mauritania.
We're working on it, Donna. We're working on it.
I would say, hey guys, what you're doing to my colleague, my friend, my fellow traveler is not right. But there's this stony silence. And I would like to ask the Yoruba members of this panel what they feel about this. Because whether you like it or not, Tinubu is a Yoruba leader. And Fayose, who is the former governor of Ekiti State, and a political opponent of Tinubu, but from the same Yoruba nation, has expressed displeasure about the way Tinubu has been treated. I wonder whether Yoruba people are going to fight back on this, or whether because Tinubu has become so venal, so corrupt, etc., they will just let it go.
I think I wouldn't know if this is what Yoruba people are going to do. For me, every time I've heard that he was probably set up, which I also agree with you guys, I don't think he ordered the shooting, but I am of the opinion that he is not an innocent, and he's gotten away with a lot of things for a very long time. So if this is what it takes, fine. But at the same time, I have seen on Twitter people saying that people are trying to make it like a tribal thing. People are saying that they're Yorubas, they're trying to bring down Tinubu. They want to remove all Southerners that have power. They only want Northerners to be in power. And I'm like, I don't know how it always gets back to this kind of situation when it didn't start. And we're saying that when they were shooting, nobody was saying, are you Yoruba? We're only shooting Hausa, we're only shooting Igbo. They were doing everything. So I think that, but the conversation has kind of shifted to they're trying to get rid of the Southerners for 2023.
Can I say something? I don't think, though, that this was, guaranteed. Yes, there are always concerns, whether founded or unfounded, about Southerners being a target and seen as most of the economic wealth is concentrated in the South. But I think that Tinubu himself was a target. We've seen a lot of reports in the last 1 month about Goodluck Jonathan being mooted as an option to come back, since he can only do one term, and then power return to the North in the long term, as another 8 term. So I just think that this specifically bringing in Tinubu into the matter was deliberate, him targeted. You can see that, for example, his former proteges like Kayode Fayemi and the guy in Ondo State, I can't remember his name now. They've all been somewhat directly, publicly or privately, been disassociating themselves from him. Even during this matter, Femi Gbajabiamila, who is a Tinubu boy through and through, hasn't particularly commented on Tinubu's travails, right? So it's almost like people are aware of a plot, to take Tinubu out, and not necessarily all Southerners. I still think, though, there's a much grander, bigger plot that's still going to unravel. But for now, the most visible, probably the biggest fish, that we call biggest collateral damage, is Bola Tinubu. I don't know whether it's a targeting of the Yorubas. I wouldn't like to think so.
Maybe a lot of these Yoruba boys who owe their political careers to him, including Sanwo-Olu and Baja, maybe they are relieved that someone who has actually been quite an oppressive boss, a political boss, is being brought down a peg or two. Because you might recall that Tinubu was the one who has up till now been the one who would decide who was governor of Lagos. And he took Ambode out because of some tussle over some disobedience on Ambode's part. So maybe the reason that some Yorubas are not too upset is because they've, it's like having a very oppressive parent who's been removed from the scene, and you may regret it in some ways because you owe that parent something, but maybe now you are free to fly without being constantly held back. And that's one possibility. And something else I would like to say, because, I really totally understand identity politics in this country, but that's another story perhaps for another podcast. But something else I'd like to say is that the president said something very significant that few people have focused on. In his broadcast on Thursday evening, he said, because we caved into the demands for the disbandment of SARS, people mistaken this for weakness. So I think that he's going to, foolishly in my opinion, do the sort of iron fist thing. Any concessions henceforth will be viewed within that prism of we mustn't look weak, we mustn't look weak. And I think they're going to go after a few people to teach them a lesson and teach the rest of the lesson for encourager les autres, in case we have any ideas above our station.
Patrick, given that it's now becoming very frothy, let's say, in terms of the politics, how important is it for those in the protest movement who want to continue to push their message to coalesce and not get sidetracked into any ethnic type division making?
I think it's probably the most important step next, because as Donu said, President Buhari was talking about your movement's been hijacked, it's now been taken over by bad actors who are going to spread division and destabilize the nation. The great strength of this movement, from what we can see about it and know about it so far, is that it's absolutely national, it's absolutely pan-ethnic, it's pan-religion, it's young people who want the betterment of the society. And I think that agenda has to be pushed through whatever means they can, through the press, through the social media and all the rest of it. But it will require huge political discipline not to get sucked into these sort of age-old and extremely dead-end debates about identity politics. I know Donna would say that's probably sort of super ridiculous idealism, but I think they can counter that. I mean, the identity is we're young, we want to change the country for the better. If they can push that identity and counter this self-interested sectional politics, which does seem to be on the agenda and has been part of the response to what they're doing, I think then they're going to be in there for the long haul and have a positive effect on the society. But it will take, a real political determination and discipline to do that, because it's evident, as everyone on the panel has said, that there are some really dodgy elements out there trying to divide the protest movement, trying to weaken it and instrumentalize it for their own petty battles for the next round of power politics in 2023. And that would be, if they get instrumentalized by those people, it will be a disaster.
Patrick, it's not multi-ethnic, not strongly so. There are some laudable young northern people who've come out to say that they stand with
Kano, Dono, that governor who is extremely questionable fellow. That he has been put it on. I'm sorry, it was not as powerful in Kano and Kaduna as it has been in Lagos and Port Harcourt. I respond to that. Also in Ilorin, there have been demonstrations. But that's
the 19 northern governors, all 19 northern governors have said that they want SARS.
No, then they attended the meeting of all 36 governors, and under Fayemi's chairmanship, they agreed to a reform program for whatever reasons. I mean, let's face it, the experience of young Nigerians at the hands of the police across the country in all 36 states, no one is saying they're going to turn around and say, the status quo is okay, we like the way it is. No one's going to say that, surely.
One of the more encouraging things that I have seen on social media is attention being paid to the plight of very junior police officers, be it their pay, which is unacceptably low and very easily leads to the kind of abuses that are all too commonplace, and also the conditions in which they live, the conditions of the barracks. I've even seen, and it may even have been on your Twitter feed, Irma, ideas such as, why not love bomb a police station? Go around there with food packages, paint the front gate, help with some, basic infrastructure upgrades. Have there been any signs that the protest can keep this kind of unity message? What are the more positive directions and things that have emerged?
No, I think, I'm a Christian and I love my neighbor, but I think it is ridiculous that anyone would want to love the police by, an attempt to change them, by being kind to them. As Shein Kuti put it, they're adults, they know what is right and wrong, right? I have also been frustrated by the system where you don't see me pulling up to Abuja and standing by the gate and shooting anybody because they can't help my situation get better. They're adults, right? And apart from being able to make the call between right and wrong, they are free to protest for themselves. Honestly, they can't join the protest. Even if you won't protest, you can at least stand on the sidelines and do nothing. But people are protesting and then you're killing them in return. I honestly do not believe in that. I think that they can mobilize themselves, and try and fight for change, or maybe if they even behaved in a much more, if they were much more approachable, if they were much more kinder to people, I'm more inclined to say, okay, fine, let's take one barrack and help. Now that being said, just going to add quickly to what Donu said in the South, and that's because one, there's a northern culture of I think it's Alaisa, leave it to God. Right, so I was looking at the police control unit report last week, and I think there was only one report in a year of police brutality from Gombe. Right, it's mostly in states where there's much more disposable cash, and because of conventional rules of dressing that don't necessarily apply in the north, so these cases are more in the south, and so naturally you'd expect that more people will protest in the south than in the north. And there were, of course, people in the north talking about, generally, this is from surveying from social media, which might not be the full pointer of things, hints, and there's banditry in the north, and that southerners joined the protest. So 70%, 80% of the protests were in the south. There were some exceptions. There was Plateau State, there was Kaduna, and I think at the point there was Kano. But that's about it as far as I remember. And I know that there were also killings, even during the protest, there were killings in Zamfara and Katsina that didn't make the news, and they were also wearing protests for. The 19 governors released a statement. Simon Lalong of Plateau State released a statement. But youths in Plateau State, there was a massive turnout of both Christians and Muslims. Right, so that was Plateau State, and there's also Aminu Tambowal of Sokoto who said, he doesn't agree with SARS, which I didn't find surprising anyway, since Nyesom Wike, who is his friend, has been the only governor agitating against SARS for a long time.
But Ruth, obviously feel free to talk about any of that. But then also I would like to touch on this other issue of police reform, which is, should the states be responsible for their own police forces? Where are we on that idea, and has it been given fresh impetus by what we've seen recently?
To answer the question about this unity and police and everything, I feel like in the last couple of days, there's like something happened on Twitter, on social media rather, where there was this conversation about the North and the South, or just we against them, and a couple of people came up from spoke against that and were like, this affects us. It doesn't matter, like Tofa said, it doesn't matter who is getting killed if they're not killing you. I mean, nobody's saying that raise your hand if you're a Yoruba person, I'm gonna kill you. Everybody's getting killed, and people are realizing that, and people and if you look at this protest in the from the lenses of the young people who are protesting, everybody's coming out to protest against police brutality, and to some extent against bad governance. That so I feel like there's some form of unity going on, and that could possibly sustain this. Then to respond to an Erova's statement about killing them with kindness, I absolutely think that was ridiculous. That let's fight for, my own take was let's fight for the police reform, and just then fight for justice and leave all the kindness thing to whoever wants to be kind. Now, to the police, state policing, I haven't read the Police Reform Act, or something that is called, but I think that if we remember a couple of months back, before COVID, the state governors in the Southwest and some governors in the northern region were talking about Amatekun and something of similar to that. And the reason they were doing this was because they had no control over the police and the security system of their state. So they wanted something to, although people politicize that as saying that they wanted to fight against the herders who are, this was coming as a response to herders' attack on farmers and things like that. But if we listen to the core of the message, it was that they've been talking, state governors have been raising the issue of state policing for years and years and years, that we need to have our own, we need to have control over this police force that we have. So I think that this brings up that conversation again, that I know that there are many dimensions to this, but it brings up the question of the state governors having control of the state. Look at what happened at Lagos State, for instance. Look at the day they were trying to bail out somebody from police detention. Even Baja, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Even the speaker of the speaker, the fourth most powerful person in Nigeria, was frustrated. They could not take that person. They had to, like, it was such a war to release somebody from police detention because the DPO said that she's closed, she's gone to home to sleep. So, but if we have in my mind, I feel like if there's some form of state policing, or the state governors are able to have control over provision of security in their state, maybe that will be a good thing to consider.
I'd also like to say, based on conversations with senior Northerners who are friends of mine, that some of them were highly sympathetic, but there was, whatever anyone says, there was a very, very, very minimal Northern involvement in this whole landscape of protest in the past couple of weeks. There have been some people involved. There are some people who want to be involved. And the crux is that, according to my friends, many of them, they've been warned as a such right. The party line is, do not join these Southerners in whinging on about this SARS or anything else, because they are just using this as an excuse to get rid of our brother Buhari, right? Which is actually probably not the case, but they're very, very, the powers that be are very paranoid and very concerned about the real motivation of protesters. So I think that's something to remember, is that, it's not that Northerners don't want to participate. Quite a few do, and some have. But I think that, again, identity politics, it's always much more important than people acknowledge.
It's important in the most negative sense, I agree. What I would counter argue here is that Sudan is, if anything, is more fractionalized than Nigeria. It had a much more oppressive, brutal history over the last 30 years. They were running 4 civil wars against various regions of the country, run by a centralized power in Khartoum. They overcame it. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and I'm not saying it's a factor. But at the end of the day, I think the demographic shifts, the fact that most people in this movement are under 30s, they live in urbanized environments where they're mixing with each other and they're not having those historic arguments about who run. They have a bigger picture, and I'm not saying it's automatically going to be positive, and then identity politics are going to fade away. They're not. I agree, but they can be fought, and they can be tackled, and they can be confronted with the tools we have: open journalism, investigative journalism, social media activism, countering false lies, false reports and misinformation, all the rest of it. I think it can be done. I wouldn't say it's not a problem. It clearly is a problem everywhere. It's a problem in the States. It's getting to be more of a problem in Europe. That's evident. But also, I think what you're seeing in all these countries, whether it's the US, it's Sudan, etc., you're seeing a more dedicated pushback by younger people who realize that this stuff is a dead end. It's one thing to like your community. It's one thing to like your culture, speak your language and all that. That's great. That's fantastic. It's another thing to elevate that to a controlling strategy for politics. And I think, that is where the struggle is going to be, to keep this movement together and to keep it nationally representative. But,
Patrick, I would love for everybody to hold hands and sing Kumbaya. Yes? Wonderful.
Look, Donu, this is not. This has been done in countries such as Sudan. It's not going to be. It's not going to be done one day and then then it's all over. Of course, there are factions and the divisions that are going to be beyond that. But it's a question of the direction of travel. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, is the direction of travel? Is it going to be fragmentation, which is one scenario, is quite plausible scenario if this thing goes on like that, and the sort of ideas you're talking about gain traction, and it becomes that this movement is brutally repressed and so on. That is a highly probable scenario. Or can it be taken into another level of trying to bring the country more together and focusing on the critical socio-economic issues? And that is up there. That is the struggle that's going on. It's not kumbaya, of course it's not. It's going to be a struggle for that cause. No, victory is not certain. For certain, that's evident.
But look, I wrote in my newspaper, can I just say something quickly? In my newspaper column, which appears today in Vanguard newspaper, I actually said that this is actually more of a class issue than a tribal issue, and that the working classes in the North and the professionals should join hands with the working classes, the masses and professionals in the South to overcome the oppression of the system. Because the truth is that whether Muslims and Christians, in both the North and South, politicians are holding us to ransom. So we shouldn't be dwelling on tribe. We should be dwelling on, the collective interests of people who are not corruptly controlling the levers of power and financial resources.
Last word to you, Ruth. I think we can all get behind that last sentiment.
I feel like Patrick said, that we need to make sure that this is not fragmented and that the message needs to travel further. And on that, I want to say that from my experience as somebody who works in development, and as a journalist, as somebody who lives in the urban area, there's something we're forgetting, that those people who are in the, let me say grassroots for lack of a better term for it, are a lot more intelligent than we give them credit for. So if we want this movement to be sustainable, I think that there has to be a way to go meet them and convince them that give them a message or something like that makes them understand that this fight is for them, whether in the North, whether in the South, whether in the Northeast. Because if you look at this protest, pay attention to this protest, we had this protest mostly from people who are for lack of better term for it, upwardly mobile, people who are exposed to technology, people who can read something on social media and stuff like that. Let's not forget that there are hundreds of, if not thousands, if not millions of people who are not on social media, who also need to have this conversation. So is it going to be easy? No, but if these young people or the protesters and everyone, we bring everybody along and you give them a message that they understand in their language that they understand, I think that we would see a lot more progress so basically what I'm saying is, rather than having a conversation that a part of the country did participate as much as we would want them to participate, the question we should ask is that, did we involve them in the participation in the conversation in the first place?
It's a fantastic place to end this conversation, although I feel that Donu may have one final thing to say.
All right, then I'll just say it. Look, I even wonder why low-ranking policemen and soldiers would even turn their guns on protesters, because they have got even more problems than the protesters. There's actually been a rush of young soldiers going online on social media to complain about the terrible conditions they live with, the corruption of their senior officers, and all that. You sometimes wonder whether they don't feel more common cause with people who are protesting, because they've actually been treated really, really badly.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. To receive all our news and analysis on Nigeria, sign up to our newsletter on the website, theafricareport.com. If you enjoyed this discussion, please do rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It means a lot to us. I'm Nick Norbrook. Thanks for listening.